Anyway, so yun na yun. So this is just one take. I'm going to discuss lang yung ating anyway, so yun na yun. I'm Bry. I'm here to talk re-recording, a one-take recording of my talk last Friday at RubyConf Philippines. I'm going to talk about speech about Ruby and Rails. Just spend a couple of months discussing who I am. I'm Bry. I'm the resident cameraman of the Philippine Ruby Users Group. I'm also the maintainer of the site. Currently, it's pinoyrb.org, but we're going to switch it later to probably frog.org because there is, as you can see, there's some fragmentation in the name. For this talk, I'm speaking here as a teacher, an instructor. So, in the Ruby community, I am one of the mentors, one of the people who gives workshops. In this slide, I'm in this is in 2012, Rails Girls Manila 2012. I was one of the mentors there. And right now my focus is on teaching. That's probably it. Naaba ako tong part na to dun sa ng konti RubyConf kasi I expect not a lot of people know me, but people know me, so yun na yun. Also, nag-plug ako nung books ko sa LeanPub. Just go to my LeanPub kung supportan ako sa aking mga writing endeavors or kumain na mas masarap na pagkain kasi mamaya kakainin ko lang ay instant mami na may itlog. Anyway, enough of that. So you want to teach Ruby and Rails. Yeah. Many of us here kasi I was talking about the Ruby. Many of us in the Ruby community will experience teaching, and actually a lot of us want to teach simply because, well, it's important for the community to spread the word and get some fresh blood. Problem with teaching is that it's not as it looks. Later I'm going to give a link on, I'm going to expand on this, but since you're here to listen about Ruby and teaching about Ruby, one thing that you're going to have to take into account is that it's not just one thing that you have to take into account. There's a lot of things that you have to take into account about Rails, about Ruby, about web programming, about the whole ecosystem, the IT thing, and how things work in order to be an effective teacher. Because the alternative there is not taking things into account. It's just you're just going to say open Rails tutorial and tell your students just do the Rails tutorial, and you expect to magically get, at the end of the day, full-fledged Rails developer. And we've encountered people like that. We've encountered professors like that who just say, open your books to this page, or these are the slides. I'm just going to talk about these slides, and you're not going to learn anything from them. So similarly, it's not enough to have Rails tutorial, Rails bridge, or whatever a tutorial there. So yeah, you have to take into account. So this slide is I had to mention that this talk was generally shortened to 30 minutes. I expect this talk to take around 40-45 minutes because I'm going to be rambling more as opposed to what I did last Friday, which I was going through it at a really, really fast pace, and I think a lot of people didn't catch up, but I think they got the gist and many enjoyed the talk. Anyway, so let's start. The zeros point is the student, and this is actually not the first point for this talk. The first point, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, is something else. But I have to point out that the students is indirectly related to those points, because all of the other points that I'm going to list, there are four, all boil down to how you take into account your students. So those points have stuff in them, and they all deal with students, but students themselves are not a main point you have to consider. Anyway, first off, the first point is the domain. So as we all know, web development has a very, very wide domain in terms of the amount of knowledge that someone needs to become efficient and effective at it, as opposed to other uh, programming domains. As opposed to say desktop or mobile, web has way too many things to take into account. For instance, you've got your MVC, model view controller part, and you also have your infrastructure, which deals with databases and other server software. And also there are some other knowledge domains that you have to know. For instance, you've got your engineering practices, which is your sign patterns and other stuff related to the technical side of building software, and the non-technical stuff like project management, or even something as simple as choosing your favorite text editor, that type of stuff. In this graph, so each part of the graph would say each chunk of the graph would represent a piece of knowledge that you have to learn, or you can learn within that domain. So in this graph, it's increasing in complexity. So for instance, this part will probably be HTML element tags. This part would be very, very advanced UI stuff, experimental UI stuff, like, say, I don't know, CSS animations, those crazy stuff. So in this case, as I mentioned at the top part, Rails is an intermediate level tool. It's not a basic tool, but it's not that advanced. So if you put it in the graph, it covers this part of our domain. So anyway, what does this domain have to do with teaching? Well, again, it goes back to your students, because your students will have their own different levels of skill, their own skill sets. So first, you can divide your students into four types. In the first half, you've got your beginners. First is your true beginner, which is basically your stereotypical novice, someone who just didn't have prior experience and just interested in learning how to program. So you'd expect them to have at least this amount of knowledge, but in many cases it's just as low as this. So you got your people who know how to turn on the computer, and people who know how to open their browsers to .com. And if you're lucky, you might get some of these guys as true beginners. Probably, I don't know, read a bit, thing or two about HTML. Probably open their text editors and build their own first HTML pages. And as you can see here, that there is a really big gap between what they know and what Rails will eventually teach. And we're going to go back to this gap later. But if you're just going to teach Ruby, it's no problem, because Ruby, it's a language that can be taught to beginners. It's actually a lot easier to teach to beginners than, say, Java or C, and it can go way up to whatever level you. But again, Rails is not. So as we're going to talk mainly in this talk, we're going to talk about web development teaching. It's not that going. not for beginners. Anyway, you got your next type of beginner, which is your web beginners. Web beginners can go from this level to your stereotypical student. You'd expect your web beginners to be like this, say an IT student who studied a bit about programming, an IT student who's probably built a couple of static sites, messed around with some blogs or whatever, and may have some background, may have heard a thing or two about these kind of stuff, like say, I don't know, maybe heard about waterfall model or something. And you'd expect many of your prospective students will be at this. More on that later. So yeah, your next type of student would be your veterans. And your veterans would be professional developers. You could go as your first type of professional web developer would be your run-of-the-mill professional web developer. So it can go as low as this for your stereotypical junior developer, and it can go as far as maybe this for your really senior web designers. But most of the time, you're going to get something like this: people who have, I don't know, played around with, worked with CMSs, people who have done some frameworks, and may have they installed WordPress or the like. Probably have encountered projects, the stuff you encounter in projects. And finally, you've got your ninjas, which do not exist except in the vocabularies of marketers. So in reality, you're just going to get some polyglots, people who have worked in more than one framework, or full stack developers who work in all of the fields, as opposed to your some of your web developers like this would be focusing on more on the front end. Some you have sysads, some you've got backend developers. But for full stack developers, they've got a good grasp of everything from top to bottom. Polyglot, you can see them range from this level to this level. Is not going to cover because they probably would have made this talk in place of me. Anyway, so to further illustrate how how existing knowledge can affect learning, let's use myself an example. So when I started learning Rails, I was a former back-end enterprise developer, enterprise web developer. So I'm pretty good at Java, pretty good at the business logic side. I also had some good experience in databases. Did some ops work, my previous project. So my infrastructure is actually pretty good. And I've read my books: Rapid Development, Code Complete, POEAA, Refactoring, and whatever you got. So in my case, when I started learning Rails, one of the first things that I learned was this: the migrations. And in migrations, if you put it in this graph we've been talking about in the past 10 minutes, it's right here. So it's one of the basic things about data that Rails will force you to use. If you're using record, it's technically part of the infrastructure, and it's software engineering practice. And in my case, migrations made sense to me because in my previous work, we actually stored our schemas in the database. Say if you're going in the version control, say if you're going to make a new feature, say a maintenance page for, I don't know, products, you're going to create those. You are going to log those alter scripts, the SQL that will create those tables for that module in that system. You're going to log that into a spreadsheet, then commit that spreadsheet along with your changes. With migrations, well, my mind was blown because here we've got a new approach which is actually much more flexible than our previous approach. So this has its problems. Migrations isn't perfect, but at least it has a lot more use cases and it covers a lot more ground. Say, I don't know, synchronization with other people who commit at the same time, that's going to be fixed. Rolling back is a lot easier, and so on and so forth. The point here is learning migrations was easy for me because there was, in a sense, an overlap with my existing knowledge compared to what was what I was going to learn in Rails. Now compare this with the newbies. So the newbies, as we've mentioned before, they usually have a gap in knowledge. So for instance here, this would be your stereotypical, again, junior developer. They might wonder why we do migrations. Might ask, why do we have to do that? Create additional files, create an additional step when we can just open PHP MySQL, export the schema, then re-import the schema, or just go directly to the production site and open the database and run your alter scripts there. So in a sense, they don't understand that. What more for people who don't have programming experience, who don't have web development experience? Generally, it's going to be a what the fuck for them. They won't understand why you're doing it, and yeah, it's going to really turn them off. And it's not just migrations that they're going to encounter when learning Rails. There are other stuff related to Rails, related to the practice, that makes very, very little sense to the newbies. That's just Rails when you've added your Ruby idioms like, say, I don't know, mostly higher order functions and how you use that, and you show them these stuff wherein even us experienced developers would sometimes pull their hair at or spend an entire afternoon trying to troubleshoot them. So yeah, when you throw these concepts to these beginners, they might just think that you're some stupid internet meme throwing out stupid stupid stuff as they don't understand. So pretty much like a dog, that dog meme. So the rational response for them once they encountered those stuff would be to, screw this, they're going to quit. Screw this, I'm going to go back to my old language where everything makes sense. So to avoid that, you have to, again, bridge the gap. This is a very common mistake that a lot of teachers do, is that they just present they just present the course, or probably give one or two sentence explanation of why we do that. Just do it because that's how we do it, without adequately explaining why you do it. So yeah, it's not going to work. So you're going to do it the hard way and bridge the gap. So here's something that I had to cut out in my actual talk because it's going to extend the talk to 5 minutes and it doesn't really add much to the talk itself. So in addition to the crazy stuff that you might teach, to the stuff that might look crazy to your beginners, there's this big elephant in the room. I don't know. It's something that pops up often when we talk about teaching Rails, which is the whole magic thing. When I started teaching, I really didn't think anything about this magic because, again, it made sense to me. I didn't understand what they considered. And eventually, I found out some good examples, and probably the easiest example I can give of this magic is the magical link to helper. The link to helper, in your views, creates link. So it converts whatever you throw at it to a usual href element. Most of the magic is in the URL for helper or submodule of link to, but since you don't really use URL for on its own, let's just talk about link. So with link to, if you're going to show a couple of examples to it, well, here's one sample example that you're going to give it. So we got link to, the text would be show, and you've got an object. It's an active record object. So what this link to does is, given that we're doing REST, if you use link to and throw an active record to it, link to should link to that active record object. Again, with REST, you've got your URLs representing resources, and if you throw a resource at it, there's a one-to-one relationship between a resource and the URL, so the conversion makes sense. If you take time to teach REST, and you should teach REST. If you don't, this would be very magical on its own. But when you teach REST, it's really not that magical. It kind of makes sense. But as we go along, say like this, link to back action index. So instead of an active record object, you throw a hash. And this works because your view knows what current controller it is, and if you just pass it the action, this is actually a link to a back button. It goes back to the index. Say you're in a show, whether in your a new dog page, this link to will link back to a page. So okay, so we got our active record. You can throw an active record at it and throw a hash at it. But also you can throw a string. If everything fails, you can throw a string. And it's actually not that bad. But then you got this one. So what is this? So again, you're going to teach about routing, RESTful resources, and all the stuff. And in the end, you're going to see that it's actually a helper method that's auto-generated, that it's essentially just a string. So it's no different from this one. Wow, string. Okay, so you got that. It's a string. It's a method that returns a string. Then wow, you can actually do that. There's a difference between this dog's path and the dog path, which accepts, as we see in this example, an ID. So an integer ID, pass it there, it will return a string, which is a path. Okay, that's understandable. But whoa, you can do that? String and active record? Okay. Then you can also pass it a block. Okay. Yeah, you can actually remove the parenthesis. And you can even pass HTML. Screw this, I'm going back to my language. And my OpenOffice hanged. Anyway, so the point there is, I'll just restart my Office because shut down. Point there is, the whole doggy thing is, everything is going to be magical for your students. There are some things, not everything. There are some things that are going to be magical for your student. And anyway, I just scroll along. And the point is, a lot of things are going to be magical to your students. And if you don't explain to them why, it's going to turn them off. So for that example, most of the magic that you're going to be encountering are essentially abstraction. That's what people say when they say magic. And as we all know, if you've worked with crazy frameworks or largish frameworks, most of that magic, most of that abstractions are there because there is a reason for them. Because people refactor the whole stuff such that you have convenient ways of writing things down. For people experiencing it, it's going to make a lot of sense. It's going to make their lives easier. But for everyone else that hasn't seen the reason why it was refactored that way, it's going to be very, very mad. Anyway, so yeah, magic example. And by the way, the reason one of the things that you can tell your students why Link2 has a lot of this is because you're dealing with HTML, and HTML is hypertext, and hypertext deals with linked documents. And as we all know, the only way to link documents is through the ahref or the Link2. So again, back here, you have to fill them in on the secret. So for the one or two guys out there who say you can use JavaScript to change the window location, shut. Anyway, and another thing that I removed from my talk was this part. It's just 2 minutes long, but again, I had to trim a lot from my talk. Is about sites like this. Like Try Ruby interactive sites like Try Ruby and Codecademy. The problem with them is that, well, at the surface they're okay, but when you visit some forums, some learn programming forums, you're going to encounter questions like this. So, hey, I just finished Codecademy for Python, and I was wondering how do I actually do this in my computer. Or some stuff like, hey, I just installed Node.js, and Node.js, this tutorial said I have to enter this $npm install blah blah blah, and I get this error, dollar is not a command. So as you can see, the problem here is, again, there's a mismatch between what you expect your students to know and what they actually know. So for instance, you've got your true beginners. You expect these interactive websites to cover this whole ground, and after they finish that, they're going to build the next Facebook, the next Instagram, or some other stupid stuff. But in reality, it's just going to, again, as many of us know, it's just going to teach you the very, very basics of whatever you need to learn. And sadly, that's my text. That's a text later. Unfortunately, it's actually not this. So it's more like this one. There is a gap between what they know and what the whole interactive websites teach. So for instance, they need to know about the command line. For instance, example, in Try Ruby, it's going to talk to you about object-oriented programming and functions and all that. If you don't know those things, the whole Try Ruby exercise doesn't make sense. So I'm actually not a fan of tryruby.org because it's not for beginners, because most beginners don't understand that. It's not really for experienced people because Ruby is such an expressive language that you can actually just jump into more complicated interactive websites like RubyMonk. So yeah, again, there will be a gap. So that's something you have to think about when you're going to introduce people to Codecademy and the like. But again, for web beginners, it's mostly okay if you're just trying out Ruby. But again, as I mentioned, if you're trying out Ruby, you're much better off doing RubyMonk or just going through the Rails bridge or some other similar tutorials. Again, true beginners need guidance. And the worst case situation when you deal with those interactive websites is that people will think that they have learned. They, again, as I mentioned, people say, I finished the Python module, the Ruby module of Codecademy, I finished the HTML module, but they don't know how to apply that knowledge. It again produces an illusion of learning, and we don't want that because that produces more bullshit. We don't want. Anyway, so that's a long point. The next few points will be much smaller. But anyway, let's proceed to our next point, which is the purpose. When I was writing this, I was thinking about whether I'm going to call this purpose or whether to call this hype or what call this why or why. But in the end, I just decided, hey, let's just the whole purpose thing because that's what we're going to talk about. Another thing that you have to take into account about your students is you have to learn about their purpose. One thing is you have to know why they are studying Rails. Maybe they're studying it because they thought it's going to be great. They studying it because their boss said so. Or also you have to ask, why are you teaching Rails? Well, there's many reasons why. For instance, my main reason for teaching Rails is sometimes bored and I just need to practice public speaking. Or some other purpose would be because you want to build up your Rails team or you want to recruit new Rails people and so on. So those purposes are actually important. But what we're going to talk here is not those purposes. The purpose we're talking here is asking ourselves why. Why are we here? So the purpose here is more of the why, because how did it come to this? In the sense that you must understand, you must think about how it came to be that you're now here wanting to teach Rails, or why you're still here studying, using Rails when there are cases where people tried to study Rails but didn't go through with it. So how did it come this? Why are you still here? One of the most obvious answers to that question is the hype cycle. So you got into the hype because say I don't know, 7 years ago you saw the 5-minute blog presentation and you've read the tech hype and all that stuff. But when you think about it, the whole reason, hype as a reason, doesn't make sense. Because while it makes sense that the hype grabbed us in, it didn't explain why we are still here, why we haven't migrated to other platforms, totally migrated in a sense. Because again, we're polyglots, we pretty much use everything out there. But and if we just look at it at the hype, there are other languages out there, other frameworks out there, other tools out there that have been hyped since mid 2000. So if it was just the hype, we would have moved on to other languages now. Also, another counter to that hype thing is that the whole technology thing. So the hype says that Ruby and Rails are the best thing since sliced bread, but when you've worked with it for a while, you realize that it's far from perfect. For instance, you've got Ruby, scripting language, but it's slow. Koichi commented on this, but the point here is that I mentioned it that it's slow compared to compiled languages. Compiled languages like say C itself. It's also memory intensive again compared to C itself. The developers are hard to find because it's not a mainstream language like .NET languages, Java, or PHP. So developers are hard to find, and it has all the cons of a dynamically typed language, which essentially boils down to the whole thing wherein you have a new class of errors that you have to watch out for. And on the other hand, you've got Rails, which is, as you look at it right now, it's just another MVC framework. And it's huge, bloated, it's magical abstractions, and it's hard to deploy. So why are we still here? So when I thought about this question, one of the things that I had to think about when I was starting to teach is, it came to me that it wasn't the technology that was hyped that got that made us that retained us. That's the word that that retained us in this ecosystem, but it was the way of thinking. So for those of you who weren't there when the web started in the mid 90s and how it went through up to the point when Rails and Django and the other MVC frameworks rose, alternative MVC frameworks rose. So here's a quick history. So in terms of languages, we started out with CGI scripting and Perl scripting, and eventually it kind of evolved to compiled languages and a certain templating language. And at that point, people thought, hey, it's enough. We could build everything using these ones. And actually, you can build a lot of things on these ones, but eventually, people realize that you have certain advantages when using dynamic languages that have object-oriented and functional functional paradigms built, functional and object-oriented features built in, as opposed to what you have existing. So with Ruby, you've got Ruby. It's expressive. It's English-like, a lot less boilerplate, and you get a lot less boilerplate because of the approaches it uses. Functional makes a lot of code. You can cut a lot of code because of the functional programming. Meta programming also removes all the dependency injection, boilerplate, and a lot of other boilerplate and object oriented everywhere. How crazy object oriented is, even though no one knows how to use object oriented. And in addition, your developers, as don't know the Python paradox. Python paradox is an article, just Google it. Point is, there are a lot fewer Python developers, but those Python developers are far better than the guys who just learned the main on the average. And as all the pros of a dynamically typed language, which makes sense for the web, as we shall discuss in a while. And moving on to the Rails side, in terms of web applications, systems that you saw on the web started off with big ball of mud. People just create, say, this is the core functionality, you need other features. So slap on a crappy feature, slap on another crappy feature, and then you're going to get a big ball of mud. And people got fed up with it, and then they overreacted and created some frameworks that were architected by creators. They were over-designed and bloated. If you think Rails is bloated, just remember the old EJB times or the old ASP. Those were the days. And eventually, we came to a compromise. So it's not over-designed, but it has, in a sense, in Rails, it's opinionated. It's got a decent set of proven design patterns as default. And also, it's very very good for prototyping, because the main reason why it's huge and bloated, because it's a monolithic framework, and we use monolithic frameworks because we want, when we're building projects wherein we don't really know what tools you're going to need. If it's just going to a simple project, a micro framework will do, but with a large project, you're not really sure what you need to use, what tools you need to use. So best to use a bloated framework. Every language has that right now. That has most of the features that you need, and has an extension feature. So in Rails, you got your libraries. You can use it in bundler. In other languages, you got similar stuff. So yeah. So as we realize, the web is mainly prototyping. Most of your projects will be prototype, most of your projects will be thrown away, or most of your projects will be refactored. And as we saw it with Twitter, they used Rails initially, but eventually they realized parts of it were a bottleneck, so they slowly refactored it to a better frame, to a better tool set for that case. Although I think Twitter is still using a bit of the front end from the Rails part, which makes Rails actually good. As opposed to, say, as I see it, the reason for Facebook having a problem refactoring it stuff out was that it was your classic big ball of mud framework. And they're just throwing millions and millions to engineers to know how to do that, as opposed to, say, the opposite, which is Rails, the Rails and the modern framework type, which is, it's modular. If this part doesn't work, you can refactor that out, plug it in using APIs or some other magic. And again, finally, with Rails, it's continuously improving, as opposed to the older frameworks that will need a lot of refactoring. Rails will still need a lot of modification to adapt to recent trends, but the effort is not hard. And the advantage is Rails is usually ahead of the curve when it comes to trends. For instance, asset pipeline, the built-in minifying and compressing of assets. Rails had it far before anyone else did it inside of Rails. I think 2 years ahead. I don't really know if other frameworks have asset pipeline, because we all know asset pipeline. It's crazy. Anyway, point is, reason why we're still here is that it gave us a way of thinking that works. So even though many of us will use different languages, different frameworks in other projects, still we have in our toolkit Rails. We haven't totally abandoned Rails. We totally haven't abandoned. And in addition, it took advantage of the hype cycle. So as I mentioned before, the hype cycle was a con before because there were a lot of hype. But the point is, with Rails, it was one of the first hype tech things back in the day. So we got our .com crash in 99, 2000. So there was no buzz at all. But then 2004, 2005 came along. That's when we saw the first buzzes that revolutionized it. So, for instance, you've got Rails, and in extension Django, which introduced to us a different way of thinking how to build web applications. That's one of the bigger hypes. And I think the only bigger hype at that time was jQuery, which made us rethink how we use JavaScript. Made JavaScript a lot easier at a time when the JavaScript runtimes were crappy and not playing well with each other. So again, it took advantage of the hype cycle, and at that time, it got enough developers to migrate from their old language, Java, .NET, or from the PHP side, to migrate to to Rails, to Django, to Python, so on. As opposed to now, we've got a lot of hype frameworks and hype languages, and the problem with them is, well, some of them teach a new way of thinking, but their niches are so small as opposed to web development, which really needed a overhaul back then, back end and front end in terms of jQuery, as opposed to now, which have so many competing languages, so many competing frameworks that people are just disillusioned. Right now, you can get critical mass, but I don't think it's going to be that big. Anyway, history lesson over. Back to our purpose and back to our students. So the point of all this talk about the history of Rails and history of why you're here or why you're still here is that you have to take into account that what got people in, and in this case it got us in because of the hype, when there was rising interest in it, or in the current sense, the rising re-interest in it, because we realized that, hey, it sucks, but it doesn't suck that bad. So let's throw away the hype, let's do things more maturely right now, and it's rising. So the hype from that level is what you're going to see from prospectives. On the other hand, you also have to keep in mind the hype, because again, Rails is not perfect, Ruby is not perfect, and if people that you drag into your training sessions or your companies that are considering Rails look at it and see it's a golden it's not a golden hammer, it's a silver bullet, you expect them to fail, because again, so much inflated expectations, and think it's going to solve all their problems, and but then when they go through it, they just realize, not really realize, but it's more of falsely realize, or have a wrong impression that this is a stupid framework, this is a stupid language, and the expectations are. So again, point of all this 20-minute part of this talk is you have to manage your expectations. Manage your students' expectations. Tell them the pros, the cons of the language, and the reasoning why you're inside the language, why you're gonna use the language, and tell them that, say, if you're just going to make a blog, make a simple website, there are other things out there. You don't use Rails for that. On the other hand, you're going to create a web application from scratch, want to try things out, prototype stuff. Again, Ruby and Rails are really good. So in short, just don't stop explaining why previous one in the domain, don't stop explaining. So enough about the strategies involved. Let's move on to the tactics. How do we get the knowledge? How do we get our students to retain their knowledge, or to actually pick up some stuff? Again, as mentioned before, there are cases where professors just expect that you show the students the slides, you expect them to learn stuff, or give them the handouts, expect them to learn stuff. That's not enough. So in our case, we have to learn some tricks to get them to retain their knowledge of them. First main trick, it's actually pretty obvious trick, but a lot of people don't use it, is that you have to tailor your course according to the student. I mentioned before, there are multiple types of students. I teach mainly veterans, and I've got really good success with them because I don't need to teach a lot of stuff. Everything makes sense to them. I just need to point them at the right direction, give them a little. As opposed to, say, teaching beginners. Say you're onboarding junior developers, they haven't really worked on existing framework, they haven't had projects with frameworks yet, don't have an idea about how web applications work, it's going to be hard. You're going to have a lot of problems with that. It's going to take effort, but still, it's not as bad as the. And as you all know, when we do some workshops, they like Rails Girls or similar Rails workshops. They, to be honest, they won't cut it. You're going to use additional tricks to make sure that they have progress to increase your success rate with them. So, yan, mga tricks na kailangan natin. Tricks you have to learn about, you have to use to let those one-day workshop attendees continue. First trick is the scaffold. Scaffold. In order to retain your students, is you have to use it properly. There's some pros and cons. People hate it, people don't like it. I used to like it, then I used to hate it, then now I just consider it as a tool, a double-edged tool, and take these things into account. So first off, with the pros, scaffold gives students a taste of power. It piques their interest. Yeah, because again, the 5-minute blog demo that piqued a lot of interest. Because what's your alternative? So you're going to spend an entire week teaching them, bridging the gap, teaching all of the stuff that they don't know that they have to know. That's going to be boring, and again, people will not have that that diligence to do. So giving them a scaffold will pique their interest and will not think that Rails is stupid. At least not yet. In addition, it produces good sample code. So if you're starting out, you can use scaffold and look at the code it produces. And once you get the hang, once you understand all of those lines of codes, understand why there's a respond to, understand why there's a partial, render partial, and so on, you can now move on to scaffoldless pages. And in addition, tests, especially RSpec and test unit tests, don't have, many people don't have sample tests. I personally don't have a lot of my library, so that's a good start. It's for future study. On the other hand, you've got a problem with scaffold, that is a lot of students when they learn Rails, they can't get past the scaffold. They immediately go to this point where, oh hey, I got the scaffold, let's move on to the next lesson. 10 minutes later, this is their. And in turn, it gives the wrong impression to a lot of non-programmers and wannabe programmers that, hey, Rails is a set of scaffold. So again, if you're going to use scaffold, which I suggest you use it wisely. And the other tip, the other technique that you need to do when you are teaching one-day workshops or the like is you have to follow through. It's very important to follow through. Give them a roadmap. Tell them what they need to learn in order to learn Rails. Or if they already got to that point in Rails, teach them, give them a roadmap. What other stuff do I need to learn? Okay, I've mastered the MVC, all of the stuff in it. What next? Okay, so you can teach automated deployment, you can teach background processing, rescue sidekick, you can teach provisioning, and so on and so forth. And Ajax, APIs, and the like. Also, give them a couple of projects. I think this one is a project, current projects. It's a big list of projects, but it's mostly for languages. I still haven't seen a big list of web application projects, but just give them a simple project that they can work, or ask them if they have an idea that they want to build on their own, and guide them to it. Because again, if you want to be good at something, good at Rails or learn Rails in itself, you have to practice. You have to make your first 10 or so shitty apps before you can say that you're really comfortable with the language, you're really comfortable with. And in addition, just point them to the community if they have questions. Because many of them will have questions, a lot of them will not ask, but those that will ask will be open to suggestions, open to. And by discussing the community, this leads to our last point, which is the culture. So we've discussed that Rails can look stupid, look like a stupid dog meme, or Rails. There are a lot of other competing things out there. But the one thing about Rails and the Ruby community that sets it apart from others is that it has a culture. I mentioned it was a homogeneous culture, but again, if you look at Ruby users group, you're going to see a lot of common things. That's why it looks homogeneous. So let's list them down, and you'll see that you don't really see them much in other languages, other frameworks. So first is, it's most of the people that got into Ruby have Ruby as their language, have Ruby as their fourth, fifth language. So you're connecting. Okay, so it's connecting. So again, point is, Ruby is usually the second, third, or fifth or sixth language for developers in the community. So as opposed to other languages, especially, say, big example would be PHP. If you see a PHP developer, mostly, pretty much all of them have PHP as their main professional language. So they may know a bit of Java, they may know a bit of C, but in practice, many of them have only worked in a professional setting using PHP. As opposed to Ruby, you've got developers from PHP, you've got developers like me who came from Java, you've got .NET developers. So the advantage there is they're much more open-minded. People within the Ruby community are much more open-minded. They've got a lot of experience, and they still assume, a lot of us still assume things about other languages and other frameworks, but it's a lot less, shall we say, those assumptions are a lot less. In addition, the community is people within our community are constantly improving. So for example, here in last year's infographic from New Relic, they saw that the adoption of Ruby 2.0 has been very brisk, considering that Ruby 2.0 was just released last year. And well, Ruby 2.0 is very, very backward compatible, so that was not a problem. Other examples would be Rails. A lot of people upgrade Rails or even libraries. Usually it's just a bundle update away. So again, here it's constantly improving at a faster pace than other language communities. Also, the community is good at sharing knowledge. It's one of the hallmarks of the community, which is we like to share our knowledge with each other. So for instance, poster child whatever of that sharing knowledge should be GitHub. GitHub is written in Rails, run by Ruby programmers. So it promoted the culture of sharing your code. And point is, again, we like to share stuff, we like new stuff. So you're going to expect us to have these kinds of presentations, meetups wherein you got people previewing the next version of Rails and talking about their experiences with it. As opposed to other frameworks like say and other languages like say Java. Java just released JDK8, which includes Lambda, essentially closures, and you don't see a lot of communities. I don't hear much in the community about people talking, giving a preview or talking about that, except for this two Ruby user guy talked in front of Java user. Anyway, so that's the culture. It's good because people share knowledge. A lot of yeah, good stuff in the community, and it basically sets us apart from other languages frameworks. On the other hand, there is a dark side to our culture. Obviously, there's it's not the most obvious. The biggest, I think, is the myopia. Uh, there are cases, for instance, there's certain nearsightedness in certain issues. So, for instance, the example, most relevant example, which is about teaching Rails, teaching. Everyone wants to teach Ruby. Everyone wants to teach Rails. Let's do workshops. Let's build the website, interactive website. But again, it's many of these initiatives are pretty nearsighted in the sense that okay, I built this stuff, I made this workshop, it's enough. And as we've seen in the past hour or so, that there are a lot of issues. It's not teaching is not easy. There's some stuff that you need to take into account, and you don't see that discussion on that topic a lot. So that's an example of nearsightedness in the community. People are open-minded, but when they're focused on something, they tend to fail to see some other stuff. But that's not the most obvious example of myopia in our culture, in our community. The biggest example, as I see it, is how we look at operating systems. So, yeah, Macs are we worship, Windows is the devil, and Linux, we tend to ignore Linux except when we're using it in our servers, which is practically all the time. So yeah, we are all Mac users except for me, which uses both Windows and Linux. The problem with that is, I think it makes sense because Macs are really good tools. They're great hardware, great support, and if you really want to be a good developer, you're going to invest on that. The problem is, if you're going to teach Rails, and to teach Ruby, you're going to accept that almost all of your students will be Windows users. It's a common thing to see in all this in workshops, or in all of the mentors are Mac users, and none of them know how to install Rails on Windows, except for the guy like me who created his own custom installer for Rails. So yeah, point is, again, understand that you will have Windows users, and if you're really serious about teaching Ruby, about teaching Rails, you will have to study how to install it. You understand how to run things on it, like say installing Ruby installer, installing the dev kit and all those stuff, knowing what libraries, what gems you can install, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, it's going to be shallow. I'm going to be blunt to you. If you're going to teach Rails and if you're serious, you're saying that you're serious about teaching Rails, but you don't take into account Windows, I'm going to tell you that you're not really serious about it. Take this into account. And in addition, you have to give them a clear path for migration. Honestly, telling people to get a Mac, especially students, it's a douchebag move. Yes, Macs are great, but it's not within the budget of a lot of people. To be honest, especially in a third world country. So if you're going to be serious about it and not want to turn off a lot of people, consider teaching, give them other possibilities. They can install Linux on an old computer, they can explore virtualization, Vagrant, VirtualBox, VMware, or they can explore cloud solutions like Nitrous. Again, it turns off people when you tell them to get a Mac. And a lot of people who are just looking around about Rails, they have this notion that you need to have a Mac program for Ruby, program for. So that's not a good thing. And there are some other stuff within our community that will turn off a lot of interested developers. But I'll leave that as an assignment. There's a lot of drama. Just look for Ruby drama and you'll learn about a lot of the dark side about the Ruby community. I think it's part of the Mayuk. The LDR, if you want your students to grow as developers, you have to introduce them to the culture. Otherwise, they won't be any different with other. They won't grow that quickly. They won't grow that much. So in closing, discuss about the domain. You have to take into account how much your students know. You have to take into account the things that come into play to make people stay in the community and the techniques to make them stay and continue on their learning, and to take into account the culture involved. How you would introduce the culture and take advantage of it in teaching your students. And again, students. But if all this 1.5 hour talk is too complicated for you, you can always just flip your table and throw Rails away and just teach Ruby. Because Rails is hard to teach, why not just teach your students? So for web development, you've got Sinatra, our favorite micro framework, and our Jekyll, our favorite static site generator. For DevOps stuff, you've got Capistrano and Mina. For really beginner programmers, you might want to consider teaching the basics. Just learn to program or learn Ruby the hard way. Give them, shoes. How to build GUI apps that is much easier to do rather than use what all your students have used before. It's not Visual Basic easy, but it's not doing hard. You can also teach them how to make a game because of Gosu, Live Gosu, or again, similarly, you can make them download RPG Lies, wherein the scripting is mostly done in Ruby. Actually, all of it is done in Ruby. Scripting, but again, the maps and the actors, the sprites, done by RPG Maker, but the real customization comes in Ruby. So that's that. Thanks for listening. I'm probably going to delete this. I'm going to probably delete this stream and re-upload a new one, removing the possibly confidential I shown before. Thanks for listening. Probably make a blog post later after I upload this one, and see you in the next one. Oh yeah, by the way, wag na. Sa links na lang yun sa blog side. It's just going to add them as links.